Okay, welcome to the next lecture in Introduction to Game Studies. Today we are going to be talking about Graeme Kirkpatrick's Aesthetic Theory and the Video Game. This is Graeme Kirkpatrick. He was born in 1963. He has been based for most of his career out of the University of Manchester, and he has throughout his career specialized in applying critical theory to digital culture, occasionally games and occasionally other subjects. And in case you're wondering, yes, this was the best picture I could find of him on the internet. He seems to be a very mysterious guy. So before we dive in, let's talk about Kirkpatrick's project. What is he trying to accomplish with this book? In general, what he's trying to accomplish is he's trying to put forward a formalist aesthetics of video games. And he's arguing for this formalist aesthetics through several points. And we'll go over those. First, he says that the aesthetic pleasure of video games is the experience of their form. And that form is the play of time and space that they present the player. That is what we are literally experiencing, but subjectively. And we'll talk about that. Controllers are the site of play in video games. For Kirkpatrick, the controller has a much bigger role to play in our pleasure and enjoyment of games than in other theories. However, ironically, perhaps, it must actually be, the controller must be suppressed. We cannot be aware of it during play, or else play would not be possible. Video game play is primarily a form of dance. It is much more closely related to dance than it is to other art forms to which it's also often compared. And it is made up of kinemes that are choreographed and programmed by the developers. And finally, repetition is ultimately corrosive to meaning in the traditional sense. Here, Kirkpatrick is referring to things like the fictional world, the meaning that we gain from the narrative of the game. These things can be slowly corroded by the repetition of failure. All right, before we begin, I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about this term, formalism, especially because I think it's bandied about quite a bit in games discourse, but there's not quite that much real understanding sometimes about the history of this form and what it means. Formalism in general across all art forms is a concern for the way that a work of art is put together, and producing artwork that foregrounds what are thought of as kind of the elements of that art form, rather than say, traditional ideas of emotionality or semblance or something like that. So, for instance, we can see formalism in literature in the work of folks like Roman Jacobson and Renee Wellick and Austin Warren, who put forward ideas of how to understand stories and break stories down into common patterns and constituent parts that were repeated over and over again. This connects obviously deeply to the kind of patterns of language in general. And this led to a kind of understanding not just of particular types of stories, but kind of in the way that story operates across all mediums. And so you see the work of folks like Jacobson, Wellick, and Warren, even in kind of modern script analysis in Hollywood, like how to write a good story, right? That is, in a sense, a kind of formalism in literature. Formalism in art comes about a little bit more abruptly. In the mid-20th century, formalism gets established in fine art by a set of critics led by the writer Clement Greenberg, who run a kind of campaign and concerted effort to boost and to bring attention to certain artists like Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, Kandinsky, these painters who were no longer trying to present works that were necessarily connected to some kind of pictorial form, but instead were expressing the kind of very quality of paint itself, playing with the very idea of an image, of color, of composition, and of line. And this was not something that people came to naturally. This was something that formalism as a perspective and as an art practice had to be kind of politically argued for by a series of powerful critics. And of course, as a result, changed the history of fine art forever. And finally, and probably the most the most famous example of a reaction to formalism, formalism in music and dance, the premiere of The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky was actually the site of a kind of abrupt fight breaking out because of it was thought the kind of breaking with tradition that formalism, that Stravinsky's formalism presented. Although Stravinsky always kind of denied he was a formalist, he was understood to be part of a turn away from classic traditions in music that, again, were more focused on emotionality and semblance. And this is part of a long history. These three examples are just examples of how formalism operated in the mid-20th century. And we should remember that formalism did not operate in a vacuum. It was, in fact, a very specific reaction to and against the prevailing philosophy of art that had existed right before it, that had kind of that had been in control of the aesthetic temperament of society before, which was Romanticism. Romanticism, which was extremely popular from the early 19th century, maybe even you might say the late 17th century, until just about the late 20th century. Sorry, the late 19th century, and almost completely gone by the mid 20th century. It was an aesthetic that was focused mostly on emotionality, on depicting a world and a set of people and their emotions, whether this was in painting or music or literature. And formalism is very specifically a reaction against this, a movement towards appreciating art forms as art forms, a movement away from thinking that the only reason for a painting to exist is to depict human beings, to depict scenes and narratives. Instead, formalism at the beginning was seen as kind of a reaction to and a celebration of forms and art for the sake of art alone. And what's interesting is that this still remains controversial. This idea of art for the sake of art, this style of painting or music, is still not very popular with, you might say, kind of a mainstream audience. Romanticism and the idea of the purpose of art being representation is still the kind of popularly held vision of what art should be, even if it is less commonly celebrated and less commonly explored at the intellectual level. But again, we have to understand formalism in its historical place, right? That it is not something that is created for no reason at all. It is something that is, as an art practice, as an aesthetic, specifically reacting to an earlier period and an earlier kind of hegemonic idea of aesthetics. And what's interesting is that if we look at the history of games, in a sense, the opposite has happened. In a sense, earlier in the history of games, we see more abstraction, more literalism, more idea of games as being about nothing much more than themselves. Even chess, which simulates what we might think of as warfare, right? If we wanted to place a kind of romantic framing on chess, is highly abstract and has been highly abstract for hundreds of years. But over time, and with the invention of video games, the reverse as what happened in fine art has happened, right? That we have actually moved away from abstraction. We have moved away from games where it's much more clear that the main aesthetic experience of them is formal, is in their form, to a much more, you might say, romantic period, an idea that the value of games is in their ability to depict human lives, or non-human lives in the case of A Short Hike, but to depict narrative and fictional worlds. So in the history of games, we have, in a sense, gone in the opposite direction of the history of fine art. The history of fine art leads from Romanticism to formalism, whereas the history of games, we lead from a kind of hegemony of formal exploration to a much more kind of romantic idea of what the purpose of games as an aesthetic form are trying to accomplish. And we should say this repeats itself even within the short history of video games. Video games, because of the limited technical power that they could draw on, start as much more abstract experiences. And only now, as kind of graphical power and computational power have gotten cheaper and more abundant, do we see the kind of rise of a romantic sense of what games are trying to present, or what games should present. But this does present us with a problem, because we have plenty of cases now in the history of games where the primary aesthetic pleasure does not seem to be in their narrative content, does not seem to be in their fictional world. So any aesthetic theory is going to have to account for this fact. It's going to have to account not just for the world of Gears of War or the kind of narrative and sentimentality of A Short Hike, but also for the pleasure of Tetris, as much as for the pleasure of chess. As Kirkpatrick says, Tetris is primarily a plastic object with which we have experiences, and as such, it resembles a ball more than it is like a book or a film. Those objects, film and books, hold out experiences too, of course, but they are interpretive or imaginative at their core. The experiences we have playing games are only marginally concerned with meanings, and interpretation is mostly limited to working out the rules. Now, this is a kind of extreme version of formalism, but it's what we're going to be exploring in the lecture today. I certainly can understand people might have a negative reaction towards some of Kirkpatrick's ideas, but what's important is to consider them and to think about them, and to think about the task we have as game intellectuals, where when we are considering a kind of theory of games and pleasure, we really must take into account not just the kind of common pleasures of narrative and of kind of narrative anticipation, as we explored in Upton's work last week. We also have to account for the pleasures of Tetris, right? A theory of game pleasure must account not only for the pleasures of Gears of War, the pleasure of Metal Gear Solid, the pleasure of Gone Home, but also for the pleasure of entirely abstract experiences. And so formalism, as much as we may want to dismiss it in games, is always going to be a kind of active and important aesthetic framework that we have to work with. And that, I think, is what the value of looking at Kirkpatrick's work is. And we're going to look at it in detail today. All right. So let's say we're going to go with Kirkpatrick, right? We're going to at least explore this idea that games are primarily an aesthetic, a formalist aesthetic tradition, right? And that their pleasures primarily are found in their forms rather than in their content. That presents the question, what are games formed from? When we look at painting, we have an idea that the form of a painting is determined by its color, its composition, its line. When we look at a film, we might also look at composition, color. We might look at timing, at movement, at editing. So what are games formed from? What is the form of a game made out of? And what Kirkpatrick says is that games are primarily formed out of time and space, that the pleasure of games is a play with time and space. And the reason we can do this is because time and space are always experienced, not objectively, but subjectively. For instance, when we enter a space, we have no real sense of its actual kind of scientific dimensions. We don't know how many feet tall the ceiling is in this Notre Dame Cathedral. We just know that it's expansive. We know that it's large. We have an entirely kind of subjective experience of the size of this space. And the same is true, obviously, for very small spaces, right? We do not know necessarily, perhaps if we're an expert spelunker like these people, we might know exactly how many inches wide a given space is. But when we are simply seeing it in real time, when we're simply directly experiencing it, we are experiencing it instead as cramped, right? As closed in, as claustrophobic. We have all of these subjective ways that we are addressing it. that don't really connect to any kind of objective idea of how the cave exists in the world. And the same is true of time. For instance, if I pause here, you don't really have a sense maybe of how many seconds that was. Maybe you started counting towards the end just in case you were trying to figure out what was going on. But for the most part, our sense of time, or your sense of that pause, was either that it was long or short or extended or stretched. We have, again, all of this subjective language to express how we feel about a pause, to express how we feel about the passage of time. We don't really ever operate on a specific kind of empirical sense of time and space. This gap between the objective characterization of time and space and their lived reality is ineliminable. And it means that just as all experienced space is produced and shaped by our activity, so all experience of time has a rhythmic, aesthetic dimension. So for Kirkpatrick, right, what games present is an opportunity to kind of explore this subjective experience of time and space. Games are primarily rhythmic and spatial. And to the extent that they present fictional worlds, these are only as a way of tracking and moving and motivating this exploration. And this is also true, by the way, of games that are kind of less intense than a game like Sekiro. Even a game where the narrative content is perhaps the thing that we are primarily motivated by. A game like Gone Home, for instance. Much of our experience of this game is spatial, is moving through rooms, looking, tracking through space, and experiencing time. How long does it take to search a certain room? Have we been in a room so long that we become bored and we move on? This is always there. This is always the kind of moment-to-moment experience of form that undergirds the more kind of explicable and self-conscious experience of narrative. And this experience of time and space, again, is what unites these games with their more abstract counterparts, right? What unites something like Sekiro and Gone Home and Space Invaders is fundamentally this experience of time and space. And so then we have an explanation for why we can think about the pleasures of Tetris in a similar way that we would think about the pleasures of Gone Home and Sekiro. Maybe not all the pleasures, but certainly some aesthetic experience is common between all of these games, even if these games don't seem very common on their surface. Kirkpatrick continues, our actions with the game involve a temporal, embodied dimension that is integral to and even productive of the visual sensations of space we get from looking at the screen. Now, I want to call this out, right, because this is important. There are a couple of things that are important here. One is this sense that our experience of a game is importantly embodied, right? It's not merely that we are not passive observers of something. It's that we are physically operating something, that we experience physically a game, right? And we experience physically the time and space that the game presents. Much more immediately than we do even of the visual sensations of that game. And in fact, the visual sensations of that game, the actual images that come up on the screen, are really driven by this embodiment. It's driven by our actions in the game. It's worth noting, right, that we think of games, we can sometimes feel like games push us, but actually we mostly push them. If you ever just stop in a game, in fact, not much happens most of the time. The game doesn't continue to run. The game kind of sits and waits for us to push against it. It waits for us to move the controller, to move the stick forward. And then the game begins again. And this is because games are not pushing at us. If we are not moving, if we are not exploring, then games do not have any time and space to present to us. They simply stop. They're simply inert, waiting for us to activate them again. So what do we use to activate our games? What do we use to push through the time and space, the form that games present us? According to Kirkpatrick, it's the controller. And the controller and Kirkpatrick's attention to it is probably the most distinct thing about his aesthetic theory. I want to go back for a moment to this, which I presented last week, the kind of standard model of games. Again, we have kind of the player. The player reads a screen. They input certain commands into the controller. That controller then feeds those commands into the computer. The computer feeds the result of those commands onto the screen. And this is the kind of core loop. And as we saw in Upton, there is this kind of mental model that happens while this feedback loop is happening, as the player tries to get a sense of what is going on inside of the computer, a thing that they can't have any direct observation of. But importantly, the way that Kirkpatrick differs from Upton is whereas for Upton, the mental model was the most interesting thing going on, right? That for Upton, his idea was that we are not paying enough attention to the ways that the player is building and exploring their mental model outside of the main feedback loop of gameplay. For Kirkpatrick, he's actually not interested in the mental model at all. For Kirkpatrick, it's the controller. It's the actual physical input of instructions that often gets overlooked when we're discussing video games. Their pleasures, even their ontology. Often we overlook the controller as the actual site of play and the actual embodiment of our actions. And this is no accident. As Kirkpatrick says, the controller is not just hardware, nor is it software, and is also not straightforwardly a transmitter of player intention in the game. It is the most concentrated intersection of all of these. It is the key element in gaming. And what he means here is that obviously it is hardware, but what the controller can do and what it means in the game is often determined by the software that we are exploring, the form that we are moving into. And it is not obviously that it's just a transmitter of intention. In fact, the fact that we make mistakes all the time with controllers means that it is not a perfect transmitter of our intention. But it is where play is happening. It is that when we think about where a game is happening, it is not just happening on the screen. And Kirkpatrick would argue not even primarily happening on the screen. It is happening in our hands. It is happening on the controller. It is the key in the feedback loop that actually makes it work. Without the screen, we might have other ways of displaying the function of the computer. And obviously without us, we wouldn't be able to act at all. But it's the controller that ties us very specifically to the computer. The screen is really just a reaction to the actions that we're taking with our hands. And we are reacting to the result of the actions we take with our hands, not necessarily just to what we're seeing on the screen. And what's interesting is that when we look at controllers, while there have been enormous numbers of experiments throughout the years, and I won't go through all of them, the controller itself is more of a kind of evolution than other aspects of games, where other aspects of games such as graphics and genre are constantly taking leaps forward and radically changing from one thing to another, or so it can feel. The evolution of the controller is much more deliberate. It's much slower and you can track actually as time passes that it's really just a slow expansion of the number of buttons and the ways that we can interact with games. And it's interesting to note, right, that for the last 15 years, the basic structure of the controller, the standard controller, I should say, remains relatively unchanged. We have kind of settled on this kind of way that we are going to interact, and we actually don't want to change it all that much. We don't want to experiment. This is true even of PC and console controls. Again, there are lots of different experiments going on in these spaces. But when we think about the standard for PC and the standard for PC controls is still very much the kind of one hand on the mouse and one hand on the keyboard. Now, whether those keys are WASD or QWER or anything else kind of doesn't matter. The idea is that we, as gamers, have become very used to a certain kind of form, right? A certain way of approaching games and manipulating them. And we're very, very loath to give that up. We're very, very loath to move out of our comfort. If you have any doubts about the idea that the controller is the site of play, is the key element in Kirkpatrick's theory, then simply think about any time you have tried to interact with a controller that you're not comfortable with. Any time that you have tried to say, here's the slime controller that this person is going to try to play Fortnite with here in a second. Anytime that you've turned on a game and realized that the mouse look is inverted, right? That it's very subtle, right? We don't pay much attention to controllers most of the time, but when they are wrong, we notice immediately. This is what Kirkpatrick means by the kind of key element. If the controls aren't right, if we are unable to understand or internalize the way a game is controlled, we really can't play it at all. We can't experience all the other elements of the game that we might think are more important to us, the graphics or the story, or even, the gameplay itself. But the controller has this kind of ironic status. The controller is the site of gaming. The controller is incredibly important. If the controls don't feel good, we don't care about almost anything else in the game. And yet, we need to suppress the controller, according to Kirkpatrick. We can't think about the controller too much. And that's one of the reasons that people don't. That's one of the reasons that the controller gets overlooked as such an important element in game playing. Because if we thought about what we were doing from moment to moment, if we thought about hitting left or right or A or B, we really wouldn't be able to do anything at all in a game. The job of the controller is to become intuitive. It's to eventually become such second nature that we can suppress our awareness of it and turn our awareness to the images. But for Kirkpatrick, we shouldn't forget that those images are primarily driven by the controller. Like we saw, if we stop manipulating the controller, the game very quickly reaches some kind of steady state and waits for us to return. Either we die and it waits for us to hit restart, or we simply stand there and the environment loops. The controller is what drives play forward. It is where we are actually playing the game when we talk about playing the game. But again, ironically, in order to play at all, we must suppress our awareness of it. We must put it out of mind. We must put it into our subconscious so that we can pay attention to all of the things that it drives forward. And this makes sense because ultimately games are a form of dance. And just like in dance, we are not necessarily concerned with the specific movement of bodies, but rather the forms that those bodies take, the tension in those bodies and the virtuosity that it takes to move that way. In video games, we're not concerned really with any individual pressing of a button. We are instead interested in the chains of action and the chains of reaction that we can take with a controller, the smooth and virtuosic manipulation of it. And so, as Kirkpatrick says, though we often compare games to things like books or movies or even theater, probably the best analogy for a game, the thing that games are most like, and maybe very well the thing that games primarily are, is a form of dance. Games are much more like the activity of dancing than they are like the activity of reading or the activity of viewing a film. And so, as Kirkpatrick says, on-screen spaces and visuals can be important. The importance, however, is relative to the contribution these sensations make to sustaining the more fundamental illusion, which is not that of the on-screen or diegetic world, but involves the coherence of a form, the movement of the dance. And so to put it in kind of, to kind of encapsulate this, right? What Kirkpatrick is saying is that the pleasure of games is in their motions, not their meaning. What we're interested in is the ways that games get us to move, not necessarily the messages that their fiction or their narrative is trying to communicate. And we can actually see this quite well in the way that death functions in games. Death, which is quite common in all sorts of forms of games, is painful and frustrating. But why is it painful and frustrating? It's not painful and frustrating because we're concerned with our character. In fact, it happens so often in most games that if we really were concerned with the character themselves, the fiction of the game, it would be unsustainable. It would be far too common. What it really is, according to Kirkpatrick, is that death is painful and frustrating because it is the interruption of the form. It breaks the coherent form that we were moving towards. The space and time, the contiguous nature of the space and time that we are exploring is suddenly severed. And we are unable to immediately recapture it, right? We have to be broken from it for a certain period of time. And so in death, we can see that we're not really that concerned ultimately with the fictional world. What we are really concerned with is maintaining smooth movement through it, is maintaining an exploration of the different forms that the game presents for us. One of the challenges with this way of looking at games is that we don't really have a language to talk about these sensations. We don't really have a language to talk about our experience of form in games, the way we have a very clear language to talk about narrative or fiction. And so Kirkpatrick attempts to supply us with at least a little bit of vocabulary that can explain what this experience is. And one of those terms is kineme. Kineme is a term that is borrowed from dance. And really what it means is it's a kind of collection of movements into a meaningful whole. For instance, probably the most recognizable kineme in video games, or one of the most recognizable kinemes in video games, is the fireball. When you see a fireball, you have a distinct understanding of the types of motions that produced this phenomenon, right? We're all familiar with the kind of down, down, forward, forward punch. These are all individual motions, but for the purposes of our understanding the form and the motions that the player had to undertake in order to throw a fireball, we understand it as a single unit. We understand it as a single set of different motions that become a recognizable kineme that we can then talk about and comment on. And in fact, we don't have to think about individual special moves, right? We could think about, in a fighting game, the combos also being kinemes. And in fact, often this is the way fighting games are designed. They're designed with specific combos in mind, and these are the kind of kinemes that developers use to think about how a match might play out. But again, this is beyond fighting games, right? We see kinemes all over video games, even video games where we might not think about the kinemes that often. For instance, this is the actual inputs for cooking in Breath of the Wild, right? You can see you open the menu, right? You move over to, say, a pepper. You pick up 2 peppers with A. You move over to another ingredient, maybe meat, right? And then you pick up one more thing, and then you hit B to exit out, and A to confirm your selection. This is a kineme. Over the course of playing Breath of the Wild, we will do this perhaps hundreds of times, to the point where we understand a recipe not as an individual set of motions or decisions, but as a whole set of motions, right? This sensation of moving through the menus smoothly and easily is the sensation of cooking in Breath of the Wild. The screen is showing us the action we're taking, but in reality, what we are understanding, how we know we are doing something correctly, is because the motions we undertake feel right. We know when we have done something right or wrong, not necessarily just because the screen confirms it, but because the kineme is so familiar to us that we know when we have experienced it in its whole. And you can also have this experience with older games. Anyone who has the familiarity of returning to an old game, say from their childhood, can probably tell you that, like, part of the nostalgia is not just for the visuals, is not just for the fictional world, but also kind of for the way that the game feels. Different eras of video games feel very differently, and so when you return to them, the nostalgia is something that you feel not just with your eyes, but with your hands. But of course, there's a problem. Like, what happens when this fails? The pleasure of games is not always just the kind of simple execution of movements. There's plenty of times when we actually fail to operate our kinemes smoothly. Our hands are unable to kind of grasp the necessary patterns. And so again, the kind of continuity and coherence of the form is severed. And again, this is because games do push on us. Once we push on them to get them going, they push back. And we have to think about how to operate them and understand the kind of forms that they want us to take. And this is their choreography, right? A game is not just simply a set of disconnected kinemes. It is a set of relationships between those kinemes. It's a set of forms that those kinemes give rise to. And so as we're playing through a game, the game will reject us and continue to reject us until we understand its choreography, until we understand the types of motions and the types of actions that we need to take with the controller. And we'll try it over and over and over again until we get it right, perhaps. This, again, is very, very different from Upton's theory, right? Remember that Upton's theory is mostly a kind of theory of decision-making, even if that decision-making is subconscious and extremely rapid. The idea that Upton has is that play is kind of always forward-looking. We are always thinking about where we are and projecting ourselves forward to where we might be or where we might want to be in the future. And this is primarily a mental exercise. This is primarily something that is happening in our head. For Kirkpatrick, this is very different. Games are kind of always in the present. You are always reacting and moving as much as you are planning. And your goal is eventually to find the proper form, the form uninterrupted. And that is where the pleasure lies, not in the planning, but in the proper execution and the kind of intuitive and subconscious motions that your hands eventually master. Observing players, it is easy to miss their appreciation of one another's manual skills because when we hear people expressing their enjoyment, even amazement at what is going on, it can seem as if they are commenting on the on-screen actions. But this isn't the case. More often, players see movement on the screen and recognize it as a sign of mastery of the hands. And I'm sure you've seen in the different videos an appreciation of that, right? That maybe you weren't really thinking about it as you watch these videos, but most of the videos I play, you have some sense of whether or not what you're seeing on screen was difficult or easy to accomplish, because you have some understanding of the different kinds of manual motions that the player is going to have to master and the player is going to have to go through. And this is the form of games. This is how we experience them. This is how we understand them. The form is present in the way that we manipulate the controller. So I want to take a moment and mention, of course, that this idea of choreography and form is present even in games that don't have a high level of rejection or failure, right? For instance, if we look at games like clicker games, right, like Cookie Clicker, it's clear, right, that whatever else is going on in Cookie Clicker, there is a pleasure in clicking itself, right? That we like clicking on things and building them because that is one of the only things we are doing in this game. Now, obviously, we also like watching numbers go up. But in order to understand how we would extend Kirkpatrick's ideas to things outside of, action games or action adventure games, we have to be cognizant and pay attention to the ways that even games that don't seem to have those kinds of behaviors still present moments for us where there's a pleasure in motion, not just in meaning. And again, this is true even in, say, visual novels or adventure games like We Know the Devil, right? Very specifically, the kind of rhythm at which they present dialogue, the rhythm at which we read it and then click through it, is very, very specifically determined by the developer. There is a kind of choreography here, and it's not complex, but it's also not completely absent. The clicking through dialogue is one of the pleasures of an adventure game, even if it's not necessarily one of the primary pleasures. However, one of the reasons that we see failure being more common in action games or action adventure games is because there is this phenomenon that Kirkpatrick calls out, which is corrosion. When we are playing a game, the constant failures, the constant interruptions of the form, of the coherence of the choreography is disruptive. It draws our mind out of the suppression of the controller. It draws our mind back to the fact that we are playing a game, that we are manipulating an object. And so it in itself interrupts choreography and slowly corrodes the kind of fictional world and meaning that we might have been enjoying along with our manipulation of the game. Now, luckily, once we properly capture choreography, once we properly employ the right kinemes in the right order at the right time, this feeling of corrosion can disappear. But it is always there. The illusion of space in games is always delicate. It is always living on the edge of our ability to smoothly and easily manipulate the game, to suppress the controller, and therefore pay attention to the fictional space and the fictional world and the narrative that the game is trying to present. And you can actually see this in the rise of what are kind of known as story modes in single-player games. This idea that there's a difficulty setting where rejection and failure become less and less a part of it, because there is this sense that rejection and failure is dangerous to the enjoyment of a story, that this corrosive effect of failure is something that most players want to avoid. And funnily enough, right, this leads us to the point that mobile games and casual games like Candy Crush or Angry Birds, with their emphasis on failure and rejection, are actually in some senses more similar to the traditional pleasures of arcade games and action games and traditional video games than are the kind of story-driven blockbusters. Okay, so here at the end, let's remind ourselves what Kirkpatrick's project is. And like I said at the beginning, it is a formal aesthetics, a formalist aesthetics of the video game. And what does this mean? Well, it means that games are forms primarily. They are forms, they are formed out of a play with time and space. We engage in that play with the controller, which is the key element of games. But ironically, we have to suppress our awareness of the controller in order to play, in order to accomplish and access these forms that we are so attracted to. And that's because games are a form of dance primarily. We discover and perform the dance that we discover in the game. And once we discover it, that is what allows us to experience the form of the game firsthand. What is that experience? What is this dance composed of? It is composed of kinemes, different units of motion, compound units of motion, we might say, that allow us to discover and manipulate and understand the overall choreography of the game as a whole. But there is always a risk, right? There is always a risk that repeated failure to internalize the choreography of a game will lead to a corrosion of meaning in the game's images and world, and will defeat the necessary suppression of the controller, that suppression that we need so vitally in order to be able to operate in the game at all. Okay, we'll end then with these words from Kirkpatrick. The appeal of games resides in the complex implications of play with rule structures, an activity that is meaningless in itself, with the shards of projected fictional meaning we find on the game interface. Our task as players is to pursue the difference between the illusory fiction and the game as rule-bound object, often until the first is forgotten altogether. All right, so let's look at some of the important ideas from the lecture. First is obviously the historical context of formalism in the different arts and how it might help us think about formalism in games. Games as formal play based on the subjective experience of time and space. the controller as the site of play, the tool with which we activate and push the game forward. There's also the idea and the necessity to suppress the controller in order to use it well. The idea that games are a form of dance with programmed choreography based on sets of kinemes. And finally, the sense that repeated failure in a game can lead to the corrosion of meaning in the game's fictional world. All right, that's Kirkpatrick. Thanks so much. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them.